Okay, we're going to start with an interesting stat. So since the beginning of agriculture, the world population has increased by 1,000-fold from roughly 7 million back then to about 7.5 billion today. And I think as soon as people hear this stat, or just even think about how many people are in the world overall, they have this immediate sense of dread where it's like, well, that's the issue, right? There's just way too many people. There's only this one Earth. There's no way that we're going to figure out how to be sustainable like this. I'd like to try to reframe this a little bit for everybody. So it turns out if you were to measure the biomass of all human beings, so you took the 7.5 billion people, put them all together, the biomass of all of humanity is about 350 million tons. And it turns out that if you measure the biomass of all the ants on the planet, put them all together, figure out that mass, it is also about 350 million tons. So that's a pretty cool just trivia fact. But one different thing between humans and ants is that humans eat roughly 3% of their body weight per day. And ants eat about 30% of their body weight per day. And what that means when you multiply it out is that ants actually eat 10 times more. They consume 10 times more of the Earth in terms of what they eat every single day compared to humanity. But we don't have news reports where we say, oh my gosh, it's all those ants. If there wasn't so many freaking ants eating 10 times more than us, we would have a chance at making a sustainable planet. Because, surprise news flashes, it's actually not the amount. It's the style in which you consume it, right? So even though ants eat 10 times more of the Earth than us every single day, every single year, they do it in a style where they actually make the ecosystem healthier in the process. They aerate the soils, they recycle nutrients. In short, ants basically create more ecosystem services than they consume, even though they consume 10 times more than us. And us, as great as we think we are, we're consuming 10 times less than that, but we somehow do it in such a poisonous style that it threatens a lot of other life on Earth. And ergo, it brings us to the question of how do we become a little bit more like ants and really like all of life? Because this rule that ants are following of creating more ecosystem services than ecosystem consumption is actually a rule that's followed by all of life right now, except for ourselves. So the big question, how does humanity produce more ecosystem services than it consumes? How does humanity, in other words, become a net positive to nature? Now, in order for us to understand that, let's look at where we are. So this has no projections. There's nothing about average temperature in the year 2100 or the climate destabilization. This is just stuff that already happened. There's no debate to be had. If you ask the oil and gas companies, they will give you the same numbers as to what's already happened. So starting back on the left-hand side of the graph, in the year 1750, before the Industrial Revolution, we had a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, 280 parts per million. And through the use of coal, oil, gas, cement, just kind of reading left to right, using some cement, doing land use changes, we have effectively added a huge amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And everything on the left-hand side is human activities. And if that's all we did, and nature didn't try to help us out at all, we would already be up at 570 parts per million. So just completely blowing past. Everybody remembers 350.org, right? Anyway, we'd be totally screwed in a way that would be just fully implausible that we could pull out of it in any reasonable time frame. But luckily, we were not alone. While we were doing all of this, actually over on the left-hand side is the way that the ecosystem responded. So the ocean has already pulled down 582 gigatons of carbon dioxide. The land has pulled down almost 650 gigatons of carbon dioxide into soils, into trees, into wetlands. And then the rest is still up in the atmosphere. The rest is still floating there, which is why, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we've moved from 280 parts per million up to 409, 410, 411, that kind of territory. And what that represents is 1 trillion tons of mass that is in the wrong place. There's 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide that is up in the atmosphere that was not there before the Industrial Revolution. And we should ask ourselves the question, if we want to become net positive nature, how do we go pay off our debts? How do we pay down the 1 trillion tons? It's also worth noting that even if we had no more emissions from this day on, even if we solved all of our emission issues, we'd still have a 1 trillion ton debt to pay. Now, in order to understand how we would approach that, very briefly, I was one of the the founding team members of Google X. So I worked on a Google Glass, self-driving car, Project Loon, all the different things there, whatever. But a thing that I learned that was really interesting from that group was the idea of an invention catalyst. Because there's a type of invention that if you go and change it, it's not just a better mousetrap. It's not just the mousetrap 20% faster or 10% cheaper. It's a thing that both improves the invention and has the potential to completely reset the entire ecosystem around it.